A spring afternoon in the seaside town of Harborview, the salty wind from the ocean drifted through the open kitchen window. On the dining table, steam still rose from a cup of coffee. Lucas sat upright, his white shirt perfectly pressed his voice, cutting through the air cold as a blade. "Mom, starting next month, your pension will be transferred into my account. I'll take care of everything." The words dropped like a stone, shattering the peace in the small kitchen. Margaret Cole, 61 years old, stared at her son in disbelief. She hadn't misheard. His calm expression made it seem like he was talking about the weather, unaware that he'd just pulled a knife from her heart. Vivian, his wife, sat beside him, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, the corner of her lips curving into a polite, insincere smile. The air thickened. Only the ticking of the wall clock broke the silence. Margaret's voice trembled. "What did you say, Lucas? Why should I transfer my pension to you?" Lucas leaned back in his chair. Fingers interlaced his tones, smooth and rehearsed the voice of a man used to public speaking. "You know, Mom, you're not young anymore. I just want to help. Your money should be managed properly. I work in finance, I know how to invest, so you won't have to worry later." Every word carried an accusation, old, weak, incapable, in need of supervision. Margaret fought to stay calm. Inside her, a storm gathered. She looked at the son she once carried on her back through the rain, for whom she'd given up everything so he could earn a college degree. Now he sat before her with the eyes of a stranger. Vivian gently placed a hand on her husband's shoulder, adding softly, "You should actually thank him, Mother. At your age, many people aren't clear-headed enough to handle money. Lucas just wants to take care of you." Her voice was sweet, but her words were velvet-wrapped blades. Margaret drew a slow breath and met her son's gaze. "Do you think I don't know how to manage my own money? I've lived my whole life without anyone's help." Lucas gave a faint, dismissive smile. "Times have changed, Mom. I just want things to be easier. You won't have to remember payment dates or worry about bills anymore. I'll take care of everything. For you." He emphasized the last two words as if he were bestowing a favor. For a brief moment, she saw the little boy he once was, standing in the schoolyard with bright eyes promising to make her proud. But the man before her was no longer that boy. He was someone else, confident, calculating, and convinced that love could be measured by bank accounts. Margaret set her teacup down the porcelain, striking the table with a sharp sound. "If that's what you want, I'll think about it." Her tone was steady, but her eyes were deep and cold as the winter sea. Lucas smiled, believing he had won. He stood and kissed her forehead, a gesture hollow and cold as duty. "I knew you'd understand." When the door closed behind him, the house fell silent. The distant sound of waves blended with the heartbeat of a mother betrayed. She sat motionless, staring through the window where the sunset was tinting the maple trees in gold. In her eyes, sorrow slowly transformed into something else, clarity. Margaret knew better than anyone that love could not be forced, and those who said for your own good were often the ones preparing to take what was most precious. She quietly walked into the living room, her eyes sweeping over the house, once filled with laughter, now still and empty. The wooden chair where her husband once read the paper, the faded wedding photo on the wall, and Lucas's old certificate of honor. Each object reminded her that everything he had today came from her sweat, her tears, and her sleepless nights. She sat down, her trembling hand reaching across the table. Amid bills and pension papers, Margaret pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside was something no one knew about: a separate savings account she'd opened 20 years ago when she was still a teacher. That small fund had grown from tutoring, pay extra lessons, and every coin she'd saved through the years. She had never told anyone, not even Lucas. If one day my son is no longer the boy I trust she had once written in her journal, I will need this to stand on my own again. The open window let in a gust of sea air, scattering the papers on the table. One bill fluttered to her feet, the electricity bill in Lucas's name at his address. Margaret bent to pick it up and froze at the bold print automatic payment from the account of Margaret Cole. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just talk, her son had already acted taking control before even asking. Outside, the waves crashed harder. Inside, her heart mirrored their rhythm. Margaret smiled faintly, a sad but resolute curve of her lips. "If you want to see how weak I am." "My son," she whispered, "I'll show you." That night, Harborview slept under a veil of mist. The beam from the lighthouse cut across her window, casting light over the face of a woman writing in a leather-bound journal. The last line on the page read, "Today, Lucas demanded control. But my son, you don't know that I still hold what you'll never touch freedom." A wave thundered against the shore, as if in agreement. Margaret closed the journal, stood up, and looked around her quiet home. In that silence, a plan began to form, not for revenge, but for awakening. And from that moment on, the gentle mother was gone, replaced by a woman reborn strong, sharp, and ready to reclaim everything that was rightfully hers. The next morning, Harborview was wrapped in a veil of silver mist. Seagulls called to one another across the rooftops, and the sound of waves in the distance felt like the steady breathing of someone hiding a secret. Margaret woke earlier than usual. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window looking out at the narrow road leading to the beach. The soft morning light touched her silver hair, making it glimmer like threads of light woven into dawn. She thought about the night before Lucas's words still echoing in her mind, sharp and cold as clashing metal. She couldn't understand what had changed her son so completely. Lucas had once been the little boy who clung to her and cried the day his father left the boy, who had promised Mom, "I'll never make you sad." Yet now he spoke to her like a businessman negotiating a deal. She tightened her grip on the teacup and closed her eyes. The pain was no longer a blazing fire, but a deep, slow burn that seared beneath the surface. She had spent her life nurturing, loving, and sacrificing, and now her only child saw her as a burden to be managed. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Vivian stood there in a beige coat. Her softly curled hair perfectly styled her face, carefully made up despite the early hour. She smiled, but her eyes were cold as morning frost. "I brought you some pastries," she said lightly. "Lucas was busy, so I came instead." Margaret invited her in with a calm voice. "Thank you, but I'm not very hungry." Vivian set the box on the table, glancing around the tidy kitchen. "You've cleared out some things, haven't you?" "It feels a bit empty." "Yes, I just wanted the house to feel neater," Margaret replied, keeping her tone steady. Vivian shrugged. "Lucas is right, you know. It's risky for you to live alone like this. We just want to make things easier for you. Money documents older people can get taken advantage of so easily, you know that. Lucas is only doing the right thing." Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law, her voice soft but edged like a blade. "The right thing for who, Vivian? For me or for you two?" For a brief second, Vivian's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered her tone, turning syrupy again. "You misunderstood, Mother. We just care about you, that's all." It's just that she hesitated, then continued sweetly, "Sometimes older people don't realize when they need help. Older people." The words struck like a hammer. Margaret felt her chest tighten. The same daughter-in-law who used to call her Mom dearest was now speaking as though to a child. "Thank you for your concern." Margaret set her eyes steady, "But I'm still capable of knowing what I need." Vivian looked ready to argue, but her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and rose to leave. I have a meeting. Take care of yourself, okay?" Her final smile left behind the sharp sweetness of perfume and an air of suffocating falseness. When the door closed, Margaret sat for a long moment in silence. The truth was now clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan, a carefully crafted plan from Lucas's offer to manage her finances to Vivian's repeated hints that she was no longer clear-headed. She looked around the kitchen that once brimmed with memories. The photo of Lucas in his graduation gown seemed to fade in the light. Rising, she walked to her bedroom and opened the drawer of an old wooden cabinet. Inside was a small wooden box containing her savings book, a few old papers, and an unsent letter, the letter from her husband who had left 30 years ago. She read a few lines. "I'm sorry, I wasn't brave enough. Forgive me if you can." Margaret smiled faintly, a mix of bitterness and strength. She folded the letter and placed it on top, a quiet reminder that she had learned long ago how to rise after betrayal. And this time she would rise again. That afternoon, the wind changed direction. Margaret stepped outside, looking down the road toward town. A few children rode their bicycles past, their laughter mingling with the sound of waves. On the porch across the street stood Thelma Rogers, her neighbor, short, silver-haired, tending her plants. Thelma had once been a lawyer before retirement. "Margaret, haven't seen you around lately," Thelma called. Margaret smiled gently and crossed the yard. "Just been busy cleaning up." Thelma tilted her head, sharp eyes narrowing. Cleaning up or hiding from someone? Margaret froze, then laughed. "You're still as perceptive as ever. A retired lawyer never loses her nose for trouble," Thelma replied, half joking, half serious. "Come on, tell me. What's got you looking like you swallowed a block of ice?" Margaret was silent for a moment, then told her everything. The talk from the day before Lucas's demand, the way Vivian had said older people shouldn't handle money. Thelma listened closely, her expression darkening. "That's not concern," she said firmly. "That's control. And if you're not careful, they'll take everything." Margaret met her gaze, fear and clarity mixing in her eyes. "I know, but I need proof. I need to know what they've actually done." Thelma nodded slowly. "Then we'll find out. You're not alone, Margaret. Don't let them think you're weak." That evening, the two women sat on the porch, watching the sun sink into the sea. One had been a lawyer, the other a teacher. Both had been dismissed once for their age, but now there was the same light in their eyes, the light of resolve. When the sun finally disappeared, Margaret returned home calm and steady. She sat at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote the first line of a new plan. Day 1, pretend to trust, but never forget. Out at sea, the lighthouse flickered on, casting a golden beam across the dark water. And in the small house of a solitary mother, another light came to life, the light of awakening. Saturday morning, the sky over Harborview was crystal clear after the night's rain. The sea shimmered under streaks of silver light, glistening like a vast mirror. Margaret woke up early, but instead of sitting by the window as usual, she carefully organized the papers in her wooden drawer. Bank statements, utility bills, and old receipts were neatly stacked in piles. Her eyes moved slowly over each number, each line of text, and the more she read, the colder her heart grew. An electricity bill carried her name, but listed Lucas's luxury apartment in downtown Portland as the address. A bank statement showed monthly transfers from her pension account into a secondary account labeled Cole Family Fund. She'd never created any fund. Worst of all, there was a credit card opened under her name, but the billing address matched the company where Lucas worked. Her hand trembled. Every doubt she had was now confirmed. Her son didn't just want control, he'd already started taking what was hers. The doorbell rang, startling her. Margaret quickly gathered the documents and tucked them back into the drawer. When she opened the door, there stood Lucas, holding a bag of coffee and a box of donuts, his smile bright and casual, as if nothing had happened the day before. "Good morning, Mom. I brought your favorite caramel and vanilla," he said cheerfully, walking straight into the house without waiting for an invitation. Margaret watched his every move, noticing how naturally he acted like someone already used to owning the place. She sat down and asked calmly, "You're up early. Aren't you busy?" "It's the weekend, Mom. I just wanted to talk for a bit." Lucas poured her coffee and pushed the cup toward her. "Did you look over the papers I brought? Everything will be so much easier if you just sign them. I just need your signature. It'll take only a minute." Margaret set the cup down, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. "Can you tell me why for the past 6 months money has been withdrawn from my account without my knowledge?" Lucas's smile faltered. "What are you talking about? And what about the electric bill for your house or the credit card opened in my name? Do you expect me to believe that's a coincidence? Or did you think I'm too old to notice?" The air in the kitchen turned cold. Lucas placed his cup down, his expression darkening. "Are you accusing me?" Mom Margaret didn't answer. She simply looked at him, the gaze of someone who once trusted completely and now saw a stranger wearing her son's face. Lucas gave a short, humorless laugh and stood up. "Mom is someone putting these ideas in your head. Is it Mrs. Thelma? You need to be careful. People your age are easily manipulated. I'm just trying to help you. Why do you keep assuming the worst about me?" Margaret gripped the edge of the table, her voice low and firm. "You're helping me by opening credit cards in my name or by using my pension to pay your bills. If that's your idea of help, I don't need it." Lucas slammed his palm on the table, his composure cracking. "Don't talk like you understand finance, Mom. Have you ever known how to invest, how to manage anything? Without me, you'd have nothing." A heavy silence filled the kitchen. Outside, the wind rushed through the pine trees, whistling like a voice of protest. Margaret lifted her head, her words slow and sharp as a blade. "You're right. Without you, I wouldn't have lost anything." Lucas drew a deep breath, forcing down his anger. "You're insulting me. Everything I do is for you. No, everything you do is for yourself." Margaret stood up. "Now leave. When I need someone to manage my money, I'll hire an accountant, not you." Lucas stared at her, torn between fury and disbelief. He had never heard his mother speak to him like that. No tremor in her voice, no weakness, just a cold, steady calm. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. But remember this, Mom. You've got no one else but me." He walked out, the sound of his car engine fading down the street. Margaret stood still in the middle of the room, her shoulders trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the anger that had been building for far too long. That afternoon, she went to see Thelma. They sat in the small room filled with books and old case files. Margaret placed the stack of bills and statements on the table. "Do I have enough evidence?" she asked. Thelma adjusted her glasses and examined each page. "Enough to start," she said firmly. "But to win, we'll need a lawyer." Margaret nodded slowly. "Do you still know anyone in the field?" Thelma's eyes glinted with confidence. "I do. Someone who owes me a favor. Smart, discreet, and most importantly, he can't stand people who prey on the vulnerable." She picked up the landline and dialed a number. "Anthony Reed," she said into the receiver. "I need your help with a case, a mother being defrauded by her own son." Margaret sat quietly, listening to the low, steady male voice on the other end. After a few minutes, Thelma hung up and smiled. "He's in. Tomorrow we'll meet him at the old office on Harbor Street." Margaret took a deep breath. The fear was still there, but beneath it flowed something new, strong, cold, determined. For the first time in years, she no longer felt powerless. That night, as the sea breeze drifted through the window, Margaret opened her notebook and wrote Day 2. The truth can't stay hidden forever, and the deceiver will soon learn that the one he thought weakest is the one holding the final move. Outside, the beam from the lighthouse swept across the ocean, glowing bright for an instant, before fading into the dark. In that fleeting light, Margaret Cole knew the battle had truly begun. The next morning, a thick fog blanketed Harborview. Margaret wrapped herself in a gray wool sweater and walked along the cobblestone street that led to a small law office tucked near the shore. Her steps were slow, and Lucas's voice echoed in her mind. "You have no one but me." The words were colder than the morning wind. The building at number 12 Harbor Street was old, its brick walls stained by sea salt, but the sign reading, "Reed and Associates Legal Consultation," gleamed as if freshly polished. Margaret took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the scent of coffee mingled with the smell of new paper. A young man looked up from a pile of files, his voice calm and firm. "Mrs. Cole, I assume I'm Anthony Reed. Mrs. Rogers said you needed help." Margaret sat down and began recounting everything from the afternoon her son demanded control over her finances, to the electric bill bearing her name at Lucas's home. Her tone was steady, but her hands tightened around her teacup. Anthony listened carefully, his expression growing darker with each detail. "What you're describing is elder financial abuse," he said, "but we'll need solid evidence." Margaret reached into her bag and handed him a bundle of documents, bank statements, bills, unfamiliar credit card records. "This is everything I have." Anthony examined them one by one, nodding. "Good. Now we need to freeze all the old accounts and open new ones that only you can access. I'll help you coordinate with the bank and file the necessary reports." She hesitated. "If I do that, Lucas will find out. He'll come here." Anthony looked up, his voice low but steady. "Then you need to be ready." Not with fear, but with truth. Their meeting ended close to noon. As Margaret stepped outside, the sky was clearing. She stood on the steps, feeling the sunlight break through the mist. It felt as though she had just opened a new door, one that led away from the life of a submissive mother and into the life of a woman reclaiming her own choices. That afternoon, she went to Harborview Central Bank. The young teller was kind and patient. "This account will be under your control only. We'll review every previous transaction," she explained. When Margaret signed her name, her hand was steady. The teller smiled. "You're very brave." Margaret simply nodded. Brave, that might be the only instinct she had left after years of endurance. On her way home, she stopped by Thelma's house. The place smelled faintly of lavender. Thelma was playing soft jazz and looked up, eyes bright. "So how did it go?" "It's done," Margaret replied calmly. "Anthony took the case. By tomorrow, all my accounts will be secured, and he's reviewing Lucas's transactions." Thelma chuckled. "You've stopped being afraid. I like that." Margaret's eyes grew thoughtful. "I don't want revenge, Thelma. I just want to understand why my son sees his mother as a wallet." Thelma placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes blind love creates selfish children, but now it's time to protect yourself." When Margaret returned home, night had fallen. In the dim light, a cream-colored envelope lay neatly on the table. There was no address, just a few hurried words. "Mom, I'm sorry for losing my temper. Let's talk, Lucas." She opened it. Inside was a hastily written note. "Mom, I only want to help you. Please sign those papers. I promise I won't touch your money unless it's necessary." Unless it's necessary. She repeated the phrase, a cold smile forming. No need, yet still taking. No touch, yet still claiming. Lucas's words were nothing more than reassurance, designed to unlock the final door. Margaret folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. Her anger no longer burned. It had cooled into something sharp and precise, like a freshly honed blade. She stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the sea. The white waves crashed against the rocks, dissolving into spray beneath the wind. Tomorrow, she whispered, "I'll sign, but not your papers, my son." In the small kitchen, the yellow lamp cast her shadow tall and unyielding against the wall. On the table, her leather-bound notebook lay open. She wrote the final line before closing it. Day 3. You think I am weak, but this game was never yours to control. Outside the lighthouse swept a white beam across the sea, illuminating her face. The softness once in her eyes was replaced by a new light, steady, sharp, and silent as the ocean before a rising tide. Harborview looked peaceful again, but inside that house a quiet counterattack had already begun. The next afternoon, Harborview shimmered under the sun. The sky was so clear that seagulls could be seen gliding slowly above the water. But inside Margaret's small house, the air was thick and heavy with anticipation. On the table sat a cold cup of tea beside a stack of papers she had just received from Anthony, a preliminary lawsuit and a statement confirming the freeze on her accounts. She read each line without blinking. Every word on those pages marked the boundary between a mother and a woman fighting for her own justice. A sudden knock echoed through the house, sharp and insistent. Margaret startled, barely having time to hide the documents before Vivian's voice pierced the air outside, sharp as a needle. "Mother, open the door. I know you're in there." Margaret walked slowly toward the door. When she opened it, Vivian stood there in a fitted business dress, her hair neatly tied back, her gaze cold. Behind her was Lucas, his face tense. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Vivian followed closely, arms crossed. "What's going on, Margaret? He said you refused to sign the papers. I don't understand why you'd want to cause all this tension." Margaret looked at them calmly. "I didn't sign because I'm not blind, and because I know exactly what's happening." Lucas let out a dry laugh. "Do you really think I'd hurt you, Mom? I just want to secure your future." She didn't answer. Instead, she opened a drawer, pulled out a folder of stamped bank statements, and laid them on the table. "This is the money withdrawn from my account 3 months ago, and this is a credit card opened under my name. Both are linked to your address. Explain that to me." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. Vivian's face paled, but she quickly forced a smile. There must be some mistake. Maybe the system recorded it wrong. Margaret cut her off before she could continue. "And the electricity and water bills for your house, those are under my name too." Was that a mistake? Lucas's fists clenched, his voice rising. "Has someone been filling your head with this nonsense, Mrs. Rogers? I suppose you don't understand finances. Mom, stop making trouble for yourself." Margaret stared at the man she once believed would always make her proud. "No one filled my head with anything. I just finally opened my eyes after being blinded by my own son." Vivian's tone turned sharp. "You're being unfair. He works so hard he worries about you, and you accuse him of stealing. We only want you to be safe. What kind of mother sues her own son?" Margaret lifted her chin. "The kind who's been betrayed." Lucas took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. "You're going too far, Mom. Remember, I'm all you have. If I turn my back, you'll be completely alone." Margaret met his gaze calmly. Better to be alone than live with someone who sees his mother as a wallet. The words hit him like a slap. His face flushed red, his breathing quickened. Vivian grabbed his arm. "Let's go, Lucas. This isn't worth it." But he didn't move, his eyes locked on his mother. "Fine," he growled. "If you want to fight, then you'll see what a fight really looks like." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. Margaret stood motionless for a long time, listening as the sound of the car faded into the distance. The house was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the clock. She took a deep breath, then picked up the phone and called Thelma. "They came," she said simply. How did they react, like people caught red-handed but desperate to look innocent? Thelma's voice was steady. "Good. Then it's time to file the official complaint. No more waiting." That afternoon, Margaret and Thelma went to Anthony's office. He had the documents ready. "I'll file it first thing in the morning," he said. "The process will take time, but once the case becomes public, he won't be able to deny it." Margaret said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the title printed at the top of the page, Financial Abuse and Identity Fraud. She signed her name each stroke, deliberate as if writing an oath. When they left the office, a light rain had begun to fall. Thelma handed her an umbrella. "How do you feel?" Margaret's voice was soft. "Like I've just cut a rope that's been strangling me and I can finally breathe again." That night in her small kitchen, she brewed a cup of hot tea and sat by the window listening to the rain. The emptiness inside her hadn't vanished, but beneath it flowed a deep, steady current of resolve. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Day 4, they think they can threaten me with loneliness. But I've lived with silence my whole life. Loneliness doesn't destroy me. It makes me stronger." Outside, the beam from the lighthouse swept across the water, its faint golden light reflecting in her eyes. Margaret smiled faintly, the smile of someone who no longer feared the storm, even knowing the real one had only just begun. Monday morning, the fog lifted slowly over the Harborview Sea. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, touching Margaret's frail hands as she held her coffee cup. She watched the thin trail of steam rise, her heart heavy as stone. Today, Anthony would officially file the lawsuit, and from that moment on, between her and Lucas, there would no longer be mother and son, but two sides of a case. The ringing phone broke the silence. It was Anthony. "Mrs. Cole, the documents have been filed. The bank has confirmed the freeze on all old accounts. You don't need to worry, but be prepared. The news will reach your son soon." Margaret thanked him softly, her voice trembling. After hanging up, she leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the ocean. The waves rolled steadily, calm and endless, as if indifferent to the humans drowning themselves in greed and guilt. By noon, just as she expected, the phone rang again and again. On the screen, the name Lucas flashed insistently. Margaret let it ring 5 times before answering. His voice burst through restrained anger under every word. "What did you do, Mom? Are you out of your mind? I just got a notice from the bank. They said my accounts were frozen for fraud investigation. Are you trying to ruin me?" Margaret spoke evenly. "You did that yourself, Lucas. I'm just protecting myself." "Protecting yourself by suing your own son. Do you have any idea this could destroy me?" Margaret's voice went quiet. "You destroyed me first." The line went silent for a moment. Then Lucas gave a bitter laugh. "Someone's been whispering in your ear, haven't they? That neighbor of yours. You should know the law is complicated. You won't win." "Then let the court decide," she said firmly. "From now on, if you have anything to say it through the lawyer." "No way, I won't let you make me a criminal," he shouted before slamming the call shut. Margaret set the phone down her chest, cold but steady. For the first time, she realized silence could be a weapon. She didn't need to shout or prove herself right. She only had to stand still and let the truth speak on its own. That afternoon, Thelma stopped by with a basket of apples. "Are you ready for the storm?" Margaret smiled faintly. What storm could be worse than one made of blood and family? They sat together on the porch, watching the sun lower over the sea. Thelma shared a story about a case she'd once handled, a woman deceived by her own son into signing away her rights. She stayed quiet, Thelma said, and lost everything. Don't do that, Margaret. The silence of good people is a gift to the wicked. The words cut deep. Margaret nodded slowly. No, I won't stay silent, but I also won't lower myself for revenge. I just want the truth back. That night, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat in darkness listening to the waves. Suddenly, headlights swept across her window. An engine stopped outside, followed by heavy knocking. She pulled the curtain aside Lucas. His face was tense, eyes wild. "You're not coming in," she said loudly through the door. "Mom, open up. We need to talk, no, Lucas. Everything will be said in court. You think you can win? You're destroying yourself. I won't let you ruin my life." His voice trembled with anger and fear. Margaret stayed silent. After a few minutes, his footsteps faded, and the night was still again. She peeked through the curtain, watching his car disappear around the bend. The next morning, she went to Anthony's office to sign more documents. He handed her the latest newspaper. On page 3 was a short article, "Businessman Lucas Cole under investigation for financial misconduct. Authorities examine funds linked to personal pension accounts." Anthony looked at her. "The news is out. He'll probably respond through the media. Don't worry, we have all the evidence we need." Margaret read the line, her heart heavy, yet strangely calm. Things were slipping out of Lucas's control. For the first time, he couldn't dictate the story. That evening, she opened her computer and saw his social media page. His latest post read, "Sometimes family is the real betrayer. I only wanted to help, but was betrayed instead." Hundreds of comments flooded in, defending him, pitying him. Margaret sighed softly. The online world always moved faster than real justice. Instead of anger, she simply closed the laptop and poured herself some tea. In the dim light, she wrote in her notebook, "Day 5, the storm has risen. But this time, I don't hide. I stand in the center because I know even the fiercest wind must one day die." Outside, the lighthouse swept its beam across the sea, the light glinting off her face. The woman who once trembled now stood firm as the rocks against the waves. Somewhere in the darkness, Margaret knew Lucas was struggling, but she no longer felt hatred, only the cold resolve of someone who knew she had chosen the right path. Tomorrow, the public battle would begin, and she was ready. Tuesday afternoon, the sea breeze blew strong, carrying the scent of salt and the cry of circling gulls. Margaret poured herself a pot of tea while the radio played a short news segment about a local businessman accused of misappropriating a family member's assets. She knew they were talking about Lucas, even though his name wasn't mentioned. Part of her ached, but another part felt an unexpected calm. After years of living in fear, the truth was no longer in someone else's hands. The doorbell rang. Thelma appeared, her coat damp with mist, holding a thick envelope. "Anthony sent new documents," she said. The bank confirmed it. Over the past 3 years, more than $17,000 were withdrawn from your account through unauthorized transactions. Margaret froze. 17,000, she whispered, her voice breaking. That was nearly her entire life savings. Thelma placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know it hurts to hear that number, but this is solid proof." "There's no denying it now." Margaret nodded, forcing her voice to stay calm. "What will he do next?" "He might strike back," Thelma said. "Take the story online or threaten a countersuit. But don't be afraid. We have the law, and we have the truth." As evening fell and Thelma left, Margaret sat at the table reading through each bank statement. The transactions were consistent, precise, clearly planned. Not a mistake intent. Every dollar taken was another hour she had spent tutoring students, another night she'd fallen asleep grading papers, another pair of shoes she had worn for an extra year just to save money for her son. Each withdrawal was a small cut, and together they formed a deep wound in her heart. That night she couldn't sleep. Near midnight the phone rang. an unfamiliar number. When she answered, a woman's voice trembled on the line. "Mrs. Cole." "My name is Eliza. I work with Lucas. I can't talk long, but you need to know he's trying to withdraw funds from the company to cover personal debts. They've started an internal investigation. You should be prepared. He's panicking." The call cut off abruptly. Margaret sat frozen, her pulse racing. Eliza Lucas's secretary. That meant her son hadn't just taken her money. He was sinking further, dragging his career down with him. The next morning, Anthony called. The tip from his company is true, he confirmed. They've suspended him pending investigation. This strengthens your case significantly. Margaret answered quietly, "I don't want him in prison. I just want him to stop." Sometimes Anthony said gently, "To stop, people have to pay the price. You've done what needed to be done." That afternoon, Vivian showed up, no makeup, no smile, her face drawn and pale. "Mother," she pleaded, "Lucas is falling apart. I'm begging you, please withdraw the lawsuit. I can't bear to see him like this." Margaret stood in the living room, golden light spilling across her face. "He's not falling apart from guilt, Vivian. He's falling apart because he got caught." "And did you know about this from the start?" Vivian stayed silent. Just a brief hesitation, but it was enough. Margaret continued, her voice low and steady. "You're an intelligent woman. You chose to believe in money instead of integrity, and now you'll live with that choice." Vivian turned away, tears sliding down her face without a word. The door closed behind her, leaving the air heavy with finality. That night, Margaret sat on the porch, listening to the wind howl through the pines. She thought of Lucas, the little boy who once ran after her at the bus stop, holding her hand, promising, "I'll buy you a house someday, Mom." She didn't know when that boy had disappeared, only that he had been replaced by a stranger, a man who bore her last name but had a heart as hollow as an empty shell. Suddenly her phone buzzed. A text from Lucas. "You win. Happy now." Margaret stared at the screen for a long time, then turned the phone off. She didn't reply. Win. No one wins in a war between family, but at least she had reclaimed what he had stolen, her dignity. The next morning, the news spread through town. The local paper ran the headline, "Harbor View resident accused of misappropriating family assets. Authorities confirm missing funds exceed $17,000. People whispered, half sympathetic, half outraged. Thelma stopped by, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Are you holding up?" she asked. Margaret smiled faintly, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I used to think justice was the sound of a gavel in a courtroom, but maybe it's simply the moment you find the courage to tell the truth, even when your hands are shaking." They sat by the window, watching a fine drizzle fall over the sea. Thelma said quietly, "The hardest part is over. Soon he'll have to face the consequences." Margaret nodded, eyes distant. "Yes, and I won't look away this time. If I have to, I'll face him in court. No more fear, no more silence. Outside, the waves rolled steadily, not fierce, not gentle, just the natural rhythm of the sea. Inside Margaret's heart, things were finally the same. No longer chaos, no longer pain, only the calm determination of a mother who had survived the storm and learned to stand tall. Wednesday morning, the sky over Harborview was a dull gray. The waves crashed against the rocks with a heavy rhythm like the beating of distant drums. Margaret woke with a dull ache at her temples. She hadn't slept all night, her mind replaying Lucas's tense eyes, his angry voice, and the bitter message he had sent. "You won, Mom. Are you happy now?" She rose slowly and poured herself a cup of hot tea, but her hands trembled so much that the water spilled over the saucer. The small house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock. Despite the guilt twisting in her chest, Margaret knew she couldn't stop now. Turning back would mean surrendering her strength to the very person who had treated his own mother as nothing more than a tool. By noon, Thelma arrived with an envelope in hand. Anthony sent an update, she said. Your case has been officially accepted by the investigators. They're working with the bank and Lucas's company. He's panicking and has already hired his own lawyer. Margaret silently opened the envelope. The rows of numbers, account names, and transaction dates stared back at her in neat columns. The total sum taken now exceeded $19,000. She didn't feel anger, only an empty heaviness, as though she were staring at a piece of her youth being taken away. Later that afternoon, as the wind whipped through the maples outside, the phone rang. She picked up, and Vivian's voice came through, weak, anxious. Mother, please come see Lucas. He's not okay. Margaret hesitated. You want me to come so he can talk me into dropping the lawsuit, don't you? No, Vivian said quickly. I just think you need to hear him one last time. I can't talk to him anymore. Please, just 10 minutes. Margaret sat quietly for a long moment. Outside, the rain began to fall in soft, steady drops. Finally, she agreed, not because she believed Vivian, but because she needed to close the circle of pain inside her heart. Lucas's house sat on the eastern hill, grand but empty. When Margaret entered, the stench of alcohol and smoke hit her. Lucas sat slouched on the sofa, his shirt-wrinkled eyes red from lack of sleep. He didn't look up. His voice was hoarse. So you actually came. I thought you'd be too busy counting your victory money. Margaret sat across from him, calm and composed. I didn't come to argue. I just want to know why, Lucas. He laughed, the sound bitter and twisted. Why? Because all my life I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion, saving every penny, never doing anything for yourself. I got tired of seeing you live that way. I thought if I managed the money, you'd finally relax. But then I wanted more. I deserved more, after everything you owed me. Margaret frowned slightly. Owed you? Yes, he snapped. I grew up without a father. I had to watch other kids with families while all I had was a mother who was always at work, always cleaning, always gone. I was ashamed. I deserved to be compensated. She looked at him for a long time. You call that compensation. I call it theft. I don't owe you your childhood, Lucas. I paid for it with my life. The air fell silent, broken only by the rain drumming against the glass roof. Lucas turned away, his shoulders trembling, whether from anger or shame, Margaret couldn't tell. Are you happy now? He said, finally, his voice raw. I lost my job. The papers are all over it. You won. Margaret stood slowly, her voice rough but steady. No, my son. No one won. We only lost. But I would rather lose you than lose myself. She turned toward the door, pausing for a moment. When you're ready to take responsibility, I'll still be here. But if you keep using family as an excuse to hurt others, then as far as I'm concerned, I never had a son named Lucas. The door closed behind her with a sound that echoed through the cold, empty house. Lucas sank back into the sofa, his hands covering his face. In that elegant room, the only sound left was the rain and the realization of a man who had just lost something that could never be bought back, his mother's trust. When Margaret returned home, her heart was heavy but calm. She brewed another cup of tea and sat by the window watching the sea. The rain had eased and the surface of the water was strangely still. She opened her notebook and wrote, Day 6, some battles end, not with victory or defeat, but with letting go. She closed the book and exhaled slowly. Far out over the ocean, the lighthouse cast its beam across the black water, a white streak cutting through the dark. And in that brief shimmer of light, Margaret understood that the greatest battle of her life had never been against her son, but against the fear of being forgotten, a fear she had finally overcome. The next morning, Harborview was clear and fresh after the night's rain. The air was cool and clean, the scent of salt from the sea, mingling with the lavender blooming outside the porch. Margaret opened the window and took a deep breath, though her heart still felt heavy. The confrontation with Lucas was over, yet his words lingered in her mind. I deserve to be compensated. She understood now that the child in him had never truly grown up, but that could never be an excuse for destroying others. The phone rang. It was Anthony. "Mrs. Cole, there's news. Lucas's company is negotiating a settlement. They want to end this quickly to avoid taking it to court." Margaret stayed silent. "If I agree," she asked, "what happens, then he will be required to repay the full amount, including damages, and sign an official statement admitting his misconduct. There will be no private agreements. This is the way to restore your dignity without prolonging the pain." Margaret nodded, her voice calm. "Do it. I don't want to live in resentment. I just want the truth to be recorded." That afternoon, she and Thelma went to Anthony's office to sign the settlement papers. On the table lay a thick stack of documents filled with numbers, red stamps, and one short but decisive declaration from Lucas. "Lucas Cole, admit to the unauthorized use of my mother's personal accounts causing financial loss. I accept full responsibility." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she held the paper. Not from anger, but from sorrow. One signature, and behind it, 35 years of motherhood fractured beyond repair. Thelma spoke softly. "Justice is done now, Margaret. You can rest." Margaret replied quietly, "Yes, but resting also means learning how to forgive not him, but myself." That evening, she sat on the porch gazing at the sea. A full moon hung high above its silver light shimmering across the surface of the water. Everything felt still. She took out her notebook and wrote another line. "Day 7 forgiveness doesn't erase the wrong, but it helps you walk beyond the pain." As she was closing the notebook, the phone rang again. It was Lucas. She hesitated, then answered. His voice was hoarse and faint, stripped of pride. "Mom, I've signed everything. I'll transfer the money as agreed. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Margaret stayed silent, listening to the sound of waves, faintly echoing from his end of the line. "I don't need your money, Lucas," she said softly. "I just need you to remember that respect can't be bought. I've forgiven you, but don't mistake forgiveness for things going back to the way they were." There was a quiet sigh on the other end. "I understand, I just don't know how to start again." "By living decently for the first time in your life," she answered. They stayed silent for a long while. When the call ended, Margaret looked out toward the ocean. The moonlight was brighter than ever. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the salty scent of the sea and a feeling of freedom. She whispered, "Tomorrow I will truly begin again." Harborview was peaceful, the only sound the rhythm of the waves. In the small house by the shore, the woman once thought to be fragile had finally reached the end of her journey, not with a loud victory, but with quiet peace in her heart. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains, resting softly on Margaret's face. She had finally slept through the night, the first peaceful sleep in weeks. No strange dreams, no voices calling in the dark. When she opened her eyes, a calm, unlike any other, filled her heart, as though the storms inside her had finally cleared. On the kitchen table lay a note Thelma had left the night before. "Dear Margaret, I have to go to Portland in the morning, but I've left the latest local newspaper for you. There's something in it you should see. Thelma." Margaret unfolded the paper. The headline took up half the page. Businessman Lucas Cole admits to financial fraud against a family member, promises full repayment and public apology. Beneath it was a photo of Lucas, his face gaunt, his eyes turned away from the camera. Margaret read slowly, each word sinking into her chest. It wasn't triumph she felt, but a quiet mix of relief and sorrow. The truth had finally been spoken, no more hiding, no more denial. The phone rang. It was Anthony, Mrs. Cole. The news is spreading quickly, but your part in this is done. The press is calling you brave, resolute, and an inspiration for victims of financial abuse. I thought you should know. Margaret smiled faintly. I never wanted to be an inspiration. I just wanted to keep my dignity. That's exactly why you became one. He replied sincerely. If everyone had your courage, there would be far fewer people suffering in silence. Around noon, Thelma called from Portland, her voice bright with excitement. People are talking about you at the cafe. They keep saying, that teacher Cole is incredible. I'm so proud of you, Margaret. Margaret chuckled softly. I'm not incredible, Thelma. I'm just someone who finally learned how to say enough. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked along the shoreline. The tide had gone out, leaving scattered white seashells glistening in the sand. Each step she took was steady and sure. The sea breeze lifted her silver hair, and her face glowed in the light. For the first time in years, she saw herself clearly not as a mother, not as a wife, not as a victim, but as Margaret Cole, a free woman. When she returned home, she opened her laptop. News sites were flooded with stories about the case, but in the corner of one page was a smaller headline, Harbor View Mother Launches Safe Hands Program, helping seniors manage finances and avoid fraud. Below it was a photo of Margaret shaking hands with Anthony and Thelma at a small town council meeting. She smiled. Thelma had kept her promise to turn pain into purpose. If I once allowed others to take my money and my trust, Margaret had said at that meeting, then at least now I'll help someone else avoid making the same mistake. That evening, she brewed a cup of tea and set it beside her old leather notebook. On the fresh page, she wrote her final reflection. Day 8. Justice is not only about reclaiming what was lost, but about passing on the lesson. The sea breeze slipped through the window, warm and salty. She looked out toward the distance where the lighthouse cast a golden beam across the dark water. Somewhere between the sea and the sky, she thought she heard a whisper. I'm sorry. Margaret answered softly, I heard you. Then she closed the notebook and turned off the light. That night, the gentle rhythm of the waves lulled the town of Harbor View to sleep. And in the small house by the shore, an old chapter came to an end, making way for the beginning of a new life where the woman once betrayed had finally found herself again. Sunday morning, Harbor View gleamed under the sun as if there had never been a storm. The distant sound of church bells mingled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Margaret sat on the porch, her old notebook resting on her lap, watching small fishing boats slice through the calm waves on their way back to shore. Sunlight spilled gently across her face, serene and at peace. A month had passed since the case ended. Lucas had repaid every dollar along with a letter of apology sent through his lawyer. The newspapers had gone quiet, the gossip had faded, and the town had begun to forget. But for Margaret, everything still felt like it had happened yesterday. She held no anger, only a quiet sadness, the sorrow of a mother who understood that sometimes love is not enough to save a soul that has lost its way. That afternoon, Thelma stopped by with a basket of apples and an envelope. This came for you, she said. No return address, but I'd bet it's from Portland. Margaret opened it. Inside was a simple card. No decoration, just a few careful lines written by hand. Mom, I'm starting over. I'll be joining the Community Finance Rehabilitation Center you and Mrs. Thelma founded. I want to learn how to live honestly for whatever time I have left. Thank you for not erasing me from your heart. Lucas. Margaret sat in silence, her eyes glistening. Thelma spoke softly. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they can really see. You did the right thing, Margaret. She folded the card and placed it on the table. I just hope he means it. I don't need him to be perfect. I just need him to be honest. That evening, the town council held the first meeting for the Safe Hands program, a project to help seniors manage their finances. Margaret, Thelma, and Anthony stood together on the small stage before a few dozen townspeople. She shared her story, never mentioning her son's name, only speaking of a mother who once believed that love meant enduring everything. When she finished, the room was silent before erupting into applause. A middle-aged woman in the front row began to cry, walked up to Margaret and embraced her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Because of your story, I finally have the courage to speak up. My own son has been taking control of my bank account." Margaret gently squeezed her hand. "It's never too late to take back your voice." After the meeting, Anthony walked with Margaret down to the shore. The night waves were calm, glowing under the full moon. "I used to think you'd regret taking your son to court," he said, "but I've never seen anyone face their fear with such grace." Margaret smiled faintly. "I didn't defeat anyone, Anthony. I just learned how to stand up, and sometimes that alone is victory." He nodded, his eyes warm with respect. "Have you thought about writing your story? Not to accuse anyone, but to inspire others." She looked toward the sea where the lighthouse continued its steady rotation. "Maybe I will. Not because I need to be heard, but because someone out there needs to know they're not alone." When she returned home, Margaret opened her old notebook, the one that began with Day 1, Day 2. Now she added a new page, Day 9. "No longer afraid of the dark because I've learned how to light my own lamp." She set her pen down, closed her eyes, and listened to the sound of the distant waves. In that moment, she understood that no matter how far Lucas went, the bond between them would remain not as a chain of pain, but as a thread of understanding. That night, Margaret slept peacefully. Outside, the lighthouse shone across the sea, its golden beam reaching her window like a gentle reminder that when one dares to face their pain, light will always find its way, no matter how long it takes. The first morning of summer bathed Harborview in warm, golden light. The sea lay still as glass, reflecting the quiet little houses nestled along the hillside. Margaret opened her window and let the ocean breeze sweep in, carrying the scent of salt and lavender. On the kitchen table, her cup of tea had grown cold, yet her heart felt unusually warm. Today was the grand opening of Safe Hands, the first project she had built together with Thelma and Anthony. The road leading to the town square was lined with bougainvillea blossoms. The townspeople gathered in small groups, their faces filled with anticipation. Margaret wore a pale blue dress. Her hair neatly tied her face, simple yet serene. As she stepped onto the small stage, sunlight caught her silver hair, making it shimmer softly. Thelma stood beside her, smiling with pride. Anthony began the ceremony in a clear, steady voice. "We are here today to witness a rebirth not just of one woman, but of hope itself." He gestured toward Margaret. She took the microphone, her hands slightly trembling, but her eyes bright. "I am not special," she said. "I am just a mother who once lost everything because she trusted too much, and then learned to stand up and protect herself. I believe no one should feel ashamed for taking back what's rightfully theirs. And if anyone here has ever stayed silent out of fear, I hope my story reminds you that courage has no age." The crowd erupted in applause. An elderly woman in the front row wiped away tears. A young couple whispered to each other, then joined in clapping. Thelma looked at Margaret, her eyes glimmering like summer light on water. After the ceremony, Anthony approached. "You know," he said quietly, "someone special came today but hasn't dared to come forward yet." He nodded toward the trees in the distance where a man in a white shirt stood silently watching from afar. Margaret turned. Even from that distance, she recognized the posture, the shoulders. It was Lucas. He stood still, holding a small bouquet of flowers, his gaze fixed on her. For a moment, all the sounds around Margaret seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat. "He said he'd wait until the ceremony was over," Anthony murmured. She nodded softly. "That's all right. I don't need a conversation today." It's enough to know he had the courage to come. Later in the afternoon, after everyone had gone, Margaret stayed behind to tidy the hall. The door creaked open, and Lucas stepped inside. He looked thinner, his eyes tired but calm. In his hands was a bouquet of wild daisies, her favorite flowers. "I just came to say congratulations," Lucas said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness yet. I only wanted to thank you for still living well and for reminding me of something I had forgotten: respect." Margaret said nothing. She looked at her son for a long moment, then nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to start over, Lucas, but only when they stop making excuses." "I know," he whispered. He placed the flowers on the table, then stepped back, his eyes glistening. "I won't bother you again, but when you're ready to talk, I'll be here." Margaret watched him walk out into the fading sunlight. A soft breeze stirred, lifting the bougainvillea petals into the air, spinning them gently. She closed her eyes and felt her heart grow lighter, as though she had finally set down a weight she had carried too long. That night, she sat by the window watching the moonlit sea. Thelma called. "Are you tired?" she asked. "No," Margaret replied softly. "I was just thinking sometimes forgiveness isn't about opening the door for someone else to come in, but about opening it so we can finally step out." She picked up her notebook and wrote, "Day 10. Peace doesn't come when everything ends, but when we choose to see it through compassion." Outside, the lighthouse turned slowly, its light sweeping across the clear summer sky. Harborview drifted into sleep, and at the window the woman sat quietly smiling, because she knew that tomorrow would no longer be a continuation of the past, but the first chapter of a brand new life. The next morning, a soft mist blanketed the Harborview coast. The pale light of dawn shimmered on the calm water, painting a scene so gentle it felt almost unreal. Margaret stood on the porch holding a cup of hot tea, watching the small fishing boats glide out to sea. The wind carried the scent of salt and lavender, and the morning fog brushed against her sleeves. She could feel each breath of life itself, no longer fearful, no longer rushed. A month had passed since the opening of Safe Hands. The center had quickly become a familiar gathering place for the townspeople. Each week, Margaret, Thelma, and Anthony hosted small talks guiding the elderly on how to manage their finances and recognize signs of fraud. Margaret always sat in the front row, carefully taking notes, watching every face, listening to every question. Whenever someone shared their story of losing their pension to a relative's deceit, Margaret listened quietly without judgment. She would simply say, "I understand. What matters is that today you found the courage to speak." That afternoon, a letter arrived at the center, the sender listed as Lucas Cole, Portland. Thelma held the envelope gently. "Do you want me to open it for you?" she asked. Margaret smiled. "No. Letters from Portland should be opened by the person from Portland." When the room was empty, she opened it herself. Inside was a handwritten note, every word neat and deliberate. "Mom, I'm now working at a financial recovery center in Portland. They've taken me on as a volunteer. I'm helping people who've gone bankrupt rebuild their lives. Maybe this is the only way I can make things right, by helping others avoid the path I took. I don't dare ask for forgiveness. I just hope you know that I still keep your image in my heart, like the lighthouse that shows me the way. Lucas. Margaret folded the letter carefully and pressed it to her chest. The sea breeze drifted through the open window, making the papers on the desk flutter. She lifted her gaze toward the horizon where the sky was brightening. "You finally learned how to be a man," she whispered, a soft smile curving her lips. Later in the evening, she and Thelma walked along the beach. The two old friends talked about summer and their plans ahead. Thelma wanted to start free legal workshops for older women, while Margaret planned to write her story into a small book, not to sell, but to give to those who needed courage. "Do you think you still have the strength for that?" Thelma asked. "As long as I can breathe, I have strength." Margaret replied, her tone calm, yet resolute. They stopped on the sand, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky turned shades of orange and violet, the waves rolling gently, scattering light like glitter across the surface. Margaret bent down, picked up a seashell, and placed it in her palm. "You know," she said softly, "life is like the sea. It can swallow us whole when it's angry, but it can also embrace us when we learn how to stand steady." Thelma smiled, her eyes glinting as she looked out over the water. "And now you've learned to stand steady, haven't you, Margaret?" She nodded. "Yes, but what I've learned isn't just how to stand. It's knowing when to let go." Night settled over the town as Margaret returned home. She lit a scented candle by the window. The flame flickered, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. She opened her notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote, "Day 11. Happiness isn't about forgetting those who hurt us, but about refusing to let that pain decide the rest of our lives." Outside, the sound of waves whispered softly. In the distance, the lighthouse turned its steady beam across the sky like the outstretched arms of the sea, embracing the town. Margaret leaned back in her chair, eyes closing, heart at peace. She knew that whatever tomorrow might bring, she could face it with a smile, because she had finally found the most precious thing of all, peace from within. One late summer afternoon, Harborview was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the sea and lavender from the small garden behind Margaret's house. She sat at her wooden desk, turning the pages of her nearly filled notebook, each line a step in a journey she sometimes could hardly believe she had made. From a mother once afraid of loneliness and of losing her son, Margaret had become a woman the entire town admired. Safe Handshad helped dozens of elderly residents avoid being scammed, and some had even recovered what was taken from them. Every time someone called her teacher Margaret, she smiled. Though retired, she was still teaching, only now the lessons were not about grammar or numbers, but about self-respect and courage. That afternoon, Anthony came to visit. He carried an envelope. "A national magazine wants to feature you in their Inspiring People column," he said with a proud smile. "They want you to share your story." Margaret chuckled softly. "I don't need fame, Anthony. I just want peace." "Peace can be inspiring too," he replied warmly before taking his leave. When the door closed, Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a draft of the article, its title bold at the top, "The Woman Who Dared to Say No, the Story of a Mother's Courage." She stared at the words for a long time, not out of pride, but because she finally understood that her life had become proof that pain could turn into light if one refused to let it consume them. As dusk settled, Thelma arrived. The two friends brewed tea and sat on the porch watching the sea. The sunset painted the waves in shades of red and gold. "Do you think Lucas will visit again?" Thelma asked softly. Margaret took a sip of tea, her voice calm. I'm not waiting, but I believe he will someday. I've learned to love him without expecting him to be perfect. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It just means refusing to let hatred exhaust you." Thelma smiled. "You sound like a philosopher now." Margaret laughed gently. "No, I'm just someone who's been through storms and learned how to talk to the wind." When the sun disappeared completely, the two old friends walked along the beach. The waves brushed against their feet, cold but tender. Thelma shared plans for her next project, a program connecting young volunteers with elderly people who lived alone. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes glowing softly like a lantern in the dark. On her way home, she stopped by the small shop at the end of the street and bought a bouquet of wild daisies, the same flowers Lucas had once brought her. Back home, she placed them in a glass vase by the window. "For you," she whispered. "Wherever you are, I hope you are at peace." Night fell the sky without a moon. Only the lighthouse in the distance turned steadily sweeping pale beams across the horizon. Margaret opened her notebook and wrote, "Day 12, peace is not a gift from others, but a choice we make for ourselves every single day." She set the pen down and closed the book. In the darkness, the sound of waves continued steady and rhythmic, like the breathing of the sea, like the heartbeat of a woman who had endured every loss without breaking. Margaret turned off the lights, leaving only a small candle burning. Its soft glow flickered against an old photo on the wall, her and Lucas, when he was a boy, both smiling brightly against the blue sea. This time she smiled too, without pain. That night, Harborview slept in quiet peace. And amid the whisper of the wind, it seemed as though a voice murmured, "Thank you, Mom." Margaret didn't know if it was the sea, the breeze, or just a memory, but she smiled and answered softly, "I heard you, my son." One early autumn morning, Harborview shimmered beneath a soft layer of mist. The sea was a deep, endless blue, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting a sky so clear it seemed untouched. The cries of seagulls echoed above, mingling with the laughter of children playing along the shore. Margaret's small house sat quietly amid the scene, its windows open wide to welcome the new light. She sat at her wooden table, an old notebook filled from cover to cover lying before her. The journey that had begun with the first line, day 1, pretend to trust but never forget, had now reached its final page. Margaret turned through the worn pages, her eyes filled with emotion and gratitude. Every word was a healed wound, every line a breath of survival from someone who once thought she would never recover from betrayal. A sea breeze swept in, scattering a few dried wildflower petals from the vase by the window. She rose, stepped onto the porch, and inhaled deeply. The air carried a familiar warmth, rich with salt and serenity. Her life now was simple mornings teaching financial literacy to seniors, afternoons spent walking along the beach, and evenings reading or writing letters to strangers who reached out to the Safe Hands Center seeking advice. Each day passed quietly but meaningfully. Today the center was hosting a special event titled "Those Who Once Stayed Silent." Margaret had been invited to speak. She wore a soft gray dress and a light cardigan. When she arrived, the hall was already packed. Anthony and Thelma stood by the door greeting guests. Seeing her, they smiled warmly. "Without you, none of this would exist," Anthony said. "No," she replied softly. "Without us." When the talk began, Anthony gave a brief introduction before handing her the microphone. Standing on stage, the lights cast a gentle glow across her silver hair. Her voice was calm, yet resonant. "I once thought silence was a way to keep the peace," she began, "but that silence only made others believe they had the right to trample over me. It wasn't until I lost everything that I realized sometimes saying no is the greatest act of love you can give yourself." She paused, looking out at the audience. There were elderly faces, young ones, even a few men lowering their heads in quiet shame. Margaret smiled gently. If anyone here is being taken advantage of, know that you are not alone. Stand up, even if all you can manage is one small sentence. I deserve respect. The room erupted in applause. Thelma's eyes glistened with tears, and Anthony nodded proudly. In that moment, Margaret felt something simple yet profound. Every wound she had endured had not been meaningless. They had become reminders lights to guide others out of the dark. When the event ended, Margaret stepped outside. The sun was setting over the harbor, painting everything in a golden, honey glow. In the distance, she saw Lucas standing quietly, not approaching, just smiling and raising his hand in greeting. She responded with a soft, kind look. Between them, there was no anger, now only understanding. He turned, walked toward his car, and she watched until his figure disappeared. That night, Margaret returned to her peaceful home. The kitchen glowed warmly under the yellow light. She brewed a cup of jasmine tea, sat down, and opened her notebook to write the final entry. Day 13. I am no longer the wounded mother. I am a woman who knows how to love herself. I have forgiven my son, and I have forgiven the past, because forgiveness is not to let someone else rest easy. It is to set myself free. She set her pen down, gazed at the words for a long time, and smiled softly. The ocean breeze drifted in again, carrying the gentle sound of waves like a lullaby. The next morning, Thelma stopped by. The two old friends sat on the porch watching the sunrise. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up back then? Thelma asked. Margaret looked toward the horizon, her voice slow and thoughtful. If I had stayed silent, I'd still be sitting here, but not in peace. I'd still be waiting for my son to visit, still convincing myself everything was fine, while my heart was full of cracks. I think I would have slowly died from that silence. Thelma smiled softly, lifting her cup. I'm glad you chose not to fade away. No, Margaret replied with a faint smile. I chose to live. A light breeze passed through scattering lavender petals into the sunlight. Both women sat in silence watching the sun rise from the sea. By noon, Anthony arrived carrying a camera. I'd like to take a picture of you for the center, he said. Margaret laughed. I'm far past the age of being a symbol, but you are a symbol, Anthony said, of strength and of the peace everyone seeks. The photo was taken on the porch. Margaret, sitting by the window, her silver hair tousled by the sea breeze sunlight, reflecting softly in her gentle eyes. In the picture, she didn't smile broadly, just a faint, peaceful curve of her lips, the smile of someone who has weathered every storm and remained true to herself. That night, she wrote the final page in her notebook, Day 14. No story ever truly ends, only those who pause and smile as life continues. I've learned that loss is sometimes life's invitation to begin again with yourself. She closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf, and blew out the small candle beside her. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the dark sea, lighting up each ripple as it passed. Margaret whispered, her voice blending with the sound of the waves. Thank you, life, for giving me a second chance. And there in her small house by the harbor view shore, the woman who once fell apart had truly been reborn, not by miracle, but by the courage to find herself again.